It happened the night I realized silence can make a sound. It was thin at first, like the hush before thunder, like a knife drawn slowly from its sheath. My name is Mariana Cruz, and I was 69 years old the night my only son erased me with a single sentence. The ballroom smelled of freesia and money. 150 guests shimmered under the chandeliers, forks stilled above plates of roasted sea bass. Lucas stood at the microphone, handsome, confident, everything I had spent 37 years building him to be. I thought I knew the next words that would come out of his mouth, words of gratitude, of love, maybe even pride. But then he said, while others didn't bring a single flower to this wedding. No one laughed at first. It wasn't even cruel in tone, just casual, effortless, the kind of insult that wears a tuxedo and smiles for the cameras. Then came the ripple of laughter, small, confused, polite. My throat dried. The wine in my glass tilted as though the floor itself had shifted. I could see Rafael Vega, the groom's new father-in-law, lower his eyes and tighten his jaw. I saw Isabella, my new daughter-in-law, try to disguise her discomfort behind a practiced smile. I saw my own reflection in the crystal glass, a woman who had raised her son alone after her husband walked out, a woman who'd worn hard hats instead of pearls, who'd signed paychecks for hundreds of men, who had once believed her name Cruz meant something unbreakable. The applause that followed wasn't for me. It was for the performance of gratitude, the polished illusion of a family that didn't exist anymore. 37 years of work, sacrifice, and love collapsed into a punchline. When Lucas lifted his glass to toast the man he called the father I always wished I had, I didn't hear the rest. I only heard the laughter, like nails being driven into wood. The chandeliers blurred. The orchids on the tables seemed to turn toward me, white faces watching as my son cut me out of his story in front of everyone I knew. There are moments when rage burns cold. I didn't stand. I didn't cry. I simply whispered to myself, if he says I gave nothing, then nothing is what he will receive. The thought came clean and sharp, like a blueprint already drafted inside me. I left before dessert, before the photographer could force me into another family picture that no longer had room for me. Outside, Chicago's October air was thick with lake fog. The city lights smeared into gold streaks across my windshield as I drove home. I turned off the radio because I needed to hear my own heartbeat. Each red light I passed through felt like another line being cut. The accounts I had opened in his name, the condo I'd been saving to give him as a gift, the company that had been both my livelihood and my legacy. My pulse slowed. By the time I reached my street, the decision was complete. At 1:42 a.m., I placed the company binder on my desk, the one with every deed, loan, and license I'd ever signed. My hands were steady now. The ledger of my life lay open under the lamp, and I thought of my father, who used to say, "A good builder measures twice, cuts once." I had measured love 1,000 times for my son. Now it was time for the cut. I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney, Victor Salazar. When his sleepy voice answered, I said only 6 words. "Prepare the sale. Effective immediately, Victor." That night, the city outside my window kept its noise, sirens, tires, wind, but in my house, everything stilled. I poured myself a drink, not to celebrate, but to mark the boundary. The woman who had been humiliated at her son's wedding was not the same woman signing the papers to sell a company worth $5 million. In the reflection of the glass, I saw not grief, but clarity. People think betrayal feels like fire, but it doesn't. It feels like a frozen room where even air stops moving, and in that stillness you can finally decide what you will no longer allow. If you're watching this story, I want you to pause for a moment and imagine that feeling, the instant you stop begging to be respected and start demanding it through action. If you've ever been in that place, you already understand me. And if you haven't, maybe my story will show you what happens when a mother finally refuses to stay silent. If you're enjoying this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories of courage, dignity, and quiet revenge. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. We love hearing how far these stories travel. Now, before we move on to what happened after that night, let me ask you something simple. Imagine standing in a room full of people while someone you love humiliates you in public. Do you think it's better to A. Speak up immediately and confront them, even if it ruins the celebration? Or B. Stay silent, walk away, and plan your response when the world isn't watching? I'd love to hear your answer, A or B, and why. Your thoughts might surprise more people than you think. The next morning, when the first light broke through the blinds, I was still at my desk. The ledger lay open beside an untouched cup of coffee, its surface now filmed over with cold. My phone buzzed twice, then again. I didn't need to check. I already knew it was Lucas. I could feel his confusion crossing the city, that desperate instinct of a man who had never known what it meant to lose something permanent. At 5:10 a.m., I lifted the pen that had signed every contract of my life. The name on those papers, Mariana Cruz, had once been a promise. Now it felt like a signature carved into concrete. My father used to say, "A builder's worth is not in what she owns, but in what she stands by when the storm comes." I smiled at the thought and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a box marked Foundations, 1,986, 1,994. My first blueprints, creased from the years, ink faded by sweat and hope. The one on top was dated the year Lucas was born. I had scribbled a note to myself then. Someday he'll walk through a building his mother built. I did not cry when I saw those words. I only whispered, "He did. He just forgot to notice." The city was still asleep when I called my lawyer, Victor Salazar. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep. "Mariana, everything okay?" "Yes," I said. "Better than ever. Draft the sale agreement for Cruz and Stone. Reach out to Midwest Meridian Holdings. Tell them I'm ready to close." He paused, waking up fast. "Are you sure you want to move that fast?" "I'm past wanting. I'm doing." By 8 o'clock, the office smelled of dust and memory. The workers hadn't arrived yet. Only Lila, my accountant of 20 years, stood by the coffee machine, reading through invoices. She looked up when I entered, her face pale from the sleepless night I hadn't told her to expect. "Señora," she said, "you saw the speech?" "I did." Her eyes filled. He meant every syllable. That's what makes it useful. I told her about the sale, the timeline, the numbers. Her lips parted, then closed again, as if she were trying to hold back a sentence she didn't want to say. "You built this company from nothing," she whispered. "You were carrying bricks while he was still in a stroller. How can you just—" "Because legacy," I said, "is not a shrine. It's a tool, and when a tool rusts, you trade it for a sharper one." At 10 a.m., Victor arrived with a briefcase full of forms. The buyer's offer was higher than expected, $4.7 million in total, $3.1 million up front, and the rest in scheduled notes. The ink was fresh, the signatures waiting. I traced the margin of the page with my fingertip before signing. When I finished, my hand felt weightless, like it no longer belonged to the woman who had once begged the bank for a $20,000 construction loan. I didn't check my phone all day. The notifications stacked up like snow calls, messages, voicemails, each more frantic than the last. Lucas's name flashed 12 times. I didn't answer. Silence, I've learned, is not absence. It's control. That afternoon, I drove to the lake condo I'd bought for him and Isabella last spring. The one with the panoramic windows and the fireplace he said would be perfect for family Christmases. It had cost $245,000 and a lifetime of hoping he'd someday understand gratitude. I stood in the doorway, listening to the echo of my heels on the empty floor. The walls still smelled of fresh paint. I thought of the future that might have lived here and said softly, "You'll have to earn your own now." By evening, Chicago's air turned heavy with rain. I poured myself a brandy and walked through each room of my house, counting what mattered. Not the furniture, not the paintings. Just the things built by effort, the ones no one could take away. The framed permits on the hallway wall, the gold compass from my first site supervisor, the safety helmet engraved with Cruz and Stone. 1,990. Proof of labor, not luck. Around midnight, A message arrived from Rafael Vega, the man Lucas had called a real father. He wrote, "Mariana, I hope you'll forgive him. Youth has a cruel tongue. Don't let this tear the family apart." I stared at that message for a long time, then typed back one sentence. Families aren't torn apart by words. They reveal who was never holding them together. I deleted it before sending. There was no point. Some lessons are meant to be silent. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time it was Mark, my ex-husband. His voice was sharp, impatient, the way it used to be when he thought he could talk me out of anything. "Mariana, I heard what you're doing. Don't be ridiculous. Selling your life's work because of a misunderstanding?" "Not a misunderstanding," I said. "A measurement." He showed me the length of his respect. I'm adjusting accordingly. "Think of Lucas," he said. "I am," I said. "For once I'm actually thinking of him." He hung up with a sigh that sounded like defeat. I didn't call him back. Instead, I called Helene, the realtor, and told her to list the condo. "Private showings only," I said. "Cash buyers. Let them know the seller doesn't negotiate sentiment." By noon, she had 2 interested couples. The market was stronger than I'd thought. Perhaps that was the universe's small way of rewarding decisive women. When I finally sat down that evening, a strange calm settled over me. The phone was silent now. Even the rain had stopped. Through the window, the city glowed a skyline of concrete proof that every heartbreak can become architecture if you build it high enough. I opened my old notebook and wrote a single line: "Respect is a foundation, not a favor, and every foundation can be rebuilt." That was the moment I realized something simple but profound. Love can make you blind, but humiliation can make you see. The night before, my son had buried me in a single sentence. This morning, I had resurrected myself with a penstroke. And in that resurrection, I finally understood the one truth every builder knows sometimes. To save the structure, you must be willing to burn down the frame. When the clock struck midnight again, I turned off the lamp and whispered into the quiet, "Tomorrow, he'll start to learn what I've always known. Words build walls, but silence builds empires." I went to bed without regret. The sale would close in 48 hours. The company that carried his name would no longer carry his entitlement. The condo that was meant to be his would belong to strangers. And for the first time in years, the future felt light, like a house finally rid of its ghosts. Outside, thunder rolled over the lake. I listened, not with fear but with a builder's satisfaction. The storm had arrived exactly on schedule. I had already reinforced the walls. By the time the sun rose 2 days later, the city looked different to me, not bigger, not smaller, just clearer, like a drawing where all the unnecessary lines had been erased. I woke before dawn and watched the pale light bleed into the skyline. Somewhere out there, concrete was being poured, cranes were groaning to life, and men in hard hats were already shouting over the hum of generators. It comforted me to know that the world was still building, even if I was done with one chapter of mine. At precisely 8 o'clock, I met Victor Salazar, my lawyer, at the downtown office. His briefcase was already on the table. The air smelled faintly of ink and paper, and the windows reflected a city that was about to watch me change my entire life. "They accepted every clause," he said, tapping the folder in front of him. "Midwest Meridian Holdings will take over full operational control within 72 hours. They're offering $4.8 million, with an initial payment of $3.2 wired at signing." I nodded, reading each paragraph slowly, tracing every name that would no longer belong to me. My father's handwriting flashed through my memory, the one he used to teach me to sign my name the first time I applied for a contractor's license. He had said, "Don't ever sign something you'll regret explaining." I was certain this, at least I would never regret. Victor's assistant brought coffee. "Do you want to call Lucas before you sign?" he asked gently. "No," I said. "He's already spoken enough for both of us." My pen pressed through the page slightly when I signed. It left a faint groove, an indentation, something that said a woman had meant it. When the final signature was done, I leaned back and exhaled. Victor slid the papers into a manila envelope as if they were something sacred. "Congratulations," he said. "You're officially retired." Not retired, I corrected. Redefined. The afternoon blurred with movement bank calls, asset transfers, emails, verifications. By 4, everything that had once been mine had turned into numbers on a screen. $4.8 million, clean and cold. I imagined how Lucas would look if he ever found out. Shocked, maybe furious, maybe even ashamed, but shame requires conscience, and that was something he hadn't shown in a long time. I returned home that evening and found the answering machine flashing. 21 messages. I listened to the first 3. They were all the same, Lucas's voice shifting between anger and pleading. Mom, call me back. What are you doing? You can't just sell everything like this. This company, it's us. I turned the machine off before the next one could start. In the silence that followed, I poured a glass of red wine and stared at the reflection of my own face in the dark window. Somewhere deep down, a younger version of me was whispering that mothers are supposed to forgive, to make allowances, to patch the cracks. But forgiveness without accountability is just another kind of indulgence, and I was done raising boys who thought love meant exemption from consequence. The next morning, Helene, my realtor, called. "We have an offer on the condo," she said. $260,000, all cash. They can close this week. "Take it," I said. "That fast?" "I've spent a lifetime waiting for other people to appreciate what I build. Not anymore." When I arrived at the notary's office to sign the closing documents, the clerk, a young woman with a nervous smile, asked, "Would you like to list your son as an emergency contact for correspondence?" I looked at her and said softly, "No, thank you. He's no longer the emergency. He's the reason for it." By evening, everything was finished. The company gone, the condo gone, the attachments that had once tethered me to obligation gone. I stood in my empty living room, surrounded by blueprints and old photos, and felt something rare, the weight of peace. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was quieter than that. It was the peace that comes when you finally stop explaining your worth to people who've already decided not to see it. But peace never lasts long in stories like mine. At 9 that night, someone began pounding on my front door. I didn't move. The knocking grew louder. "Mom, open up." Lucas's voice carried through the wood, raw, frantic, desperate. "Please, Mom, we need to talk." I let him knock for a full minute before I opened the door. He looked disheveled, tie undone, hair wild, eyes hollowed out from sleeplessness. Isabella stood behind him, pale and trembling, clutching her purse like a shield. "You sold it?" he said, voice breaking. "You sold my company?" "It was never yours," I said. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "You can't do this to me. To us. You can't just throw everything away over one stupid moment." "One stupid moment?" I repeated quietly. "You humiliated me in front of everyone I've ever respected, Lucas. You erased me, and you did it for applause." "I didn't mean it." "But you did," I said, interrupting him. "And I meant this." His eyes darted toward the signed documents on the counter, the bank confirmation printed neatly beside them. "You can't just take it all back." "That's where you're wrong. You can take back money, you can take back property, but respect, once you give it away, it doesn't return." Isabella spoke for the first time. "Mariana, please. He's been sick over this. He knows he crossed a line." "Then he can start learning how to live without crossing them again," I said. I walked them to the door. He stood there, trembling, searching my face for softness. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. "Beg?" "I don't want you to beg," I said. "I want you to build. Start from zero. You'll appreciate the view more when you climb on your own." He opened his mouth again, but I was done. I closed the door and turned the lock. For several seconds, I listened to his breathing on the other side, a shallow, wounded sound, then footsteps fading. Silence. The next morning, I woke before dawn again. The city felt cleaner somehow. I walked out to the balcony and let the wind hit my face. Below me, the streets glistened from last night's rain, catching the first light like polished marble. For the first time in decades, I felt no deadlines pressing against me, no calls to return, no guilt gnawing behind my ribs. Later that afternoon, Victor called. "Funds transferred successfully. Congratulations, Mariana, it's done." It's only beginning, I said. I've just demolished the first floor. The real foundation comes next. That evening, as I watched the sun slide behind the skyline I had helped build, a strange realization settled over me. I had always thought success meant leaving something behind. But maybe real success, the kind that endures, comes from knowing exactly when to let go. The city lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere, my son was learning what it felt like to lose what he never truly valued. And me? I was discovering what it felt like to breathe without permission. I did not hear from Lucas the next morning, nor did I expect to. The air in my house felt strangely light, like dust had finally settled after years of quiet shaking. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, wiping each countertop with the patience of someone learning to live inside her own peace. Silence can be terrifying when you are used to noise, and yet, there it was, soft, calm, mine. At noon, I made tea and sat in the sunroom. It was just beginning to warm, that thin spring sunlight that comes through like a promise. My phone sat face down on the table. For years it had dictated my breath, my movements, my urgency, surrounded by employees, contracts, a son who believed every vibration belonged to him. Now, it was just an object. A quiet, harmless square of glass. The peace did not last long. At 2:30, there came the sound of hurried steps on my front walk, followed by a knock that did not ask, it demanded. I knew that rhythm. Once, long ago, I would hear it at the door when dinner was late or when a report card had come home that wasn't perfect. That knock belonged to Gabriel, my ex-husband. I opened the door to find him standing there in a steel gray suit, hair swept back with precision, jaw locked tight like a door braced against a storm. His presence always arrived like weather, loud, insistent, occupying every inch of space, whether invited or not. He brushed past me into the foyer without waiting for permission, a habit so ingrained he probably believed it was courtesy. "What have you done?" he asked, voice clipped, measured, the tone of a man who believes authority belongs to him by default. "Good afternoon to you too," I replied. He paced the living room as though building momentum, as though anger needed space to unfold itself fully. Lucas is beside himself. Isabella called me in tears. He says you sold the company, the condo, everything. I did. He stopped pacing, turning to look at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Mariana, that business was his legacy, our legacy. No, I said quietly. It was mine. He blinked, stunned not by the truth, but by the audacity of me saying it aloud. You built that for him. I built it for a son who I believed would honor it. Honor me. That is not the man who toasted another as his father and declared I had given him nothing. Gabriel's jaw flexed. He had heard about the speech. I saw it in the way his eyes shifted, in the flicker of guilt that he tried to smother beneath old pride. He made a mistake, he said. A foolish, emotional mistake. How generous, I murmured. You weren't there. You didn't feel what it is to become invisible in a room filled with your life's proof. He softened then just a fraction, but I saw it. For all his failings, Gabriel had once loved me, in the way men like him understand love. Admiration mixed with possession. Mariana, he said gently, he's our son. He is our son, I agreed, which means he will learn, like we all did. He sat, elbows on his knees, head lowered, not defeated, but wrestling with reality that would not bend for him. I know he is spoiled, he admitted. I know we both played a part in that. I raised an eyebrow. Both? Or did I build while you cushioned? He looked up sharply. Silence stretched between us, thick enough to hold memory. I gave him what I could, he said quietly. And I gave him what he needed, I replied. Work, discipline, expectation. And still, he chose spectacle over gratitude. He leaned back, exhaling, the lines around his eyes suddenly deeper than I remembered. You're serious about this? As steel. You would cut your own son off? I didn't cut him off, I said softly. He severed the cord the moment he chose applause over blood. Gabriel stood slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket. There will be consequences for this. There already were consequences for his actions. Now there will be lessons. He stared at me a moment longer, and then, in a voice stripped bare of arrogance, he asked, "Do you hate him?" The question pierced the space between us like glass breaking in a quiet church. I swallowed. No. I love him enough to stop rescuing him. He closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a blow. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. "For his sake," he said. "I hope you're right." "For his sake," I whispered back. "So do I." When he left, the house felt heavier for a moment, not because his presence lingered, but because the past had walked through my door and reminded me of every version of myself I had shed to become this one. I stood by the window and watched him pull away, confident stride, expensive car, the polished performance of a man who had never been forced to start over. Then the door closed, and I returned to my kitchen. Tea had gone cold. I made another cup. Later that night, I scrolled through messages not from Lucas, but from old acquaintances in the industry who had already heard. News travels fast in the world of steel and concrete. Some wrote congratulations, some confusion, some pity masked as concern. One email simply said, "Bold move, brave or reckless, we shall see." I closed the laptop. The world has opinions on decisions it never had the courage to make. I stepped outside, letting the night air wrap around me. Streetlights glowed like low stars. Somewhere far away, a train horn carried across the city, the sound of departure, not arrival. For the first time in years, I realized something simple and enormous. I did not feel lost. I felt open, like the ground beneath me was not collapsing, but clearing. Space where new things could be built, not for legacy, not for inheritance, not for anyone's approval, but for me. Inside, a piece of paper waited on my desk, a list of destinations I had scribbled earlier: Santa Fe, Austin, Scottsdale, Asheville, places I had once dreamed of in quiet moments between construction deadlines and parent-teacher meetings, places where women go when they decide their next chapter belongs only to them. I touched the paper lightly. It felt like possibility. Tonight, nothing was finished. Everything was beginning. The day after Gabriel's visit, the air felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself were waiting to see whether I would keep my resolve or collapse back into the pattern that had once ruled my life. Endurance disguised as forgiveness. I didn't collapse. I woke before dawn, brewed strong coffee, and stared at the blueprint spread across my dining table. It wasn't a design for any building. It was a financial plan drawn by my lawyer, a map of what my next 70 days would look like. Every line, every margin, was a new boundary. For years I had taught architects that good structures depend on pressure, not comfort. Now I was learning that the same rule applies to love. The more you allow a structure to lean without resistance, the faster it cracks. I had spent a lifetime letting Lucas lean on me until I could no longer hold my own shape. Now, finally, I was rebuilding mine. That morning, I received an email marked urgent. It was from a name I didn't recognize: E.M. Teller, internal auditor, Cruz and Stone Builders. He must not have known the company had already changed hands. His message was short, clinical, and devastating. Miss Cruz, please confirm whether you approved recent invoice modifications under account code 411B classified as facilitation fees. The amounts are inconsistent with previous years. I stared at the screen. Facilitation fees, a polite corporate synonym for kickbacks. I called Victor immediately. Within an hour, he confirmed what I already feared. Two of Lucas's subordinates acting under his authority had added inflated consulting charges to the final months of company operations. It wasn't large enough for criminal prosecution, but it was enough to tarnish my reputation if it surfaced publicly. My son had not only betrayed me emotionally, he had jeopardized the very name that had fed him. I sat at my desk for a long time. Outside, a construction crew worked on the road, the steady thud of jackhammers punctuating the silence in my chest. I could almost hear my father's voice again. Measure twice, cut once. I had measured this boy wrong. At noon, I went to the old headquarters to sign the transfer inventory. The reception desk still bore my nameplate Cruz, polished brass. I ran a hand across it one last time, then motioned for the custodian to remove it. The office was full of small ghosts. Coffee rings on mahogany, blueprints left rolled on shelves, photographs of completed sites that no longer belonged to me. But the real ghost was my son's signature on those falsified invoices. When I left, I drove without thinking, ending up at the construction yard where the foremen gathered for lunch. They saw me and froze. Then Hector, the oldest of them, the man who had followed me from my first sight to my last, walked over with his hands still covered in dust. "Boss," he said simply, and that word boss undid me more than any insult had. He told me the men had heard rumors, that I'd sold, that the boy had been careless, that the new owners planned to keep the brand but erase my presence. "We'll remember," he said. "Every wall we built still stands because you made us check it twice." It took me a moment to answer. "Then keep building," I said. "But don't let my name be your reason. Let your work be." That evening, a journalist called someone who covered real estate acquisitions. "Miss Cruz," she said, "sources tell me your son's firm is under review for irregular payments. Any comment?" I looked out the window at the lake and answered carefully. "My only comment is this. When a foundation is built on gratitude, it stands. When it's built on entitlement, it collapses. The inspection will speak for itself." I hung up before she could press further. By the time the article came out 2 days later, the story had shifted. Veteran builder exits industry, leaves behind legacy of integrity amid investigation. The phrasing made me laugh. It sounded like an obituary written by someone too polite to name the cause of death. But something unexpected followed. Workers from old sites began sending me photos, bridges, schools, apartment complexes, each captioned with a small message, "Still standing, Senora." The support spread quietly, like roots underground. What Lucas had tried to tarnish, others were repairing with honesty I didn't even ask for. Then, late one night, another message arrived from Helene, my realtor. "A man from Meridian said one of your ex-managers tried to enter the closed office after hours. They called security. No damage, but I thought you should know." I didn't need a name. I already knew who it was. The next morning, I walked into the downtown police precinct and filed an official incident report. Not because I wanted him arrested, he was my son, but because the law needed to record that even bloodlines have boundaries. The officer, a young woman barely older than Isabella, looked at me with wide eyes as I spoke. "Ma'am," she asked gently, "do you want to press charges?" "No," I said. "I just want the truth to exist somewhere besides my heart." That night, I couldn't sleep. I went through the old documents again, the audits, the sale, the reports, and marked everything clean, sorted, final. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had served its purpose. Now I needed clarity. My revenge was already alive, breathing quietly in the fact that he no longer held power over me. At dawn, I made one last call to Victor. "Secure everything," I told him. "All transfers, trusts, statements. I want legal proof that my future can't be touched by anyone who shares my last name." He hesitated. "That's a strong line to draw." "I know," I said. "That's why it will hold." When the call ended, I sat by the window watching the sun rise over the lake. The water glimmered like molten metal, and for the first time, I felt something almost tender toward the woman, staring back at me in the reflection. She looked tired, yes, but also unshakable. The world outside hummed with ordinary life. Buses, footsteps, the distant sound of hammers. Somewhere, Lucas was probably still spinning excuses, trying to rewrite the story. But the story no longer belonged to him. It was mine again, stripped of illusion, fortified by consequence. As light filled the room, I whispered to the silence, "You build, you lose, you rebuild better." That morning marked the true turning point. Not the sale, not the confrontation, not even the betrayal, but this. The quiet certainty that I could stand alone, not because I had to, but because I finally wanted to. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in front of a small stucco house on the edge of Scottsdale, the kind of place where the light feels thicker, where the air hums like it remembers things. It wasn't grand 2 bedrooms, a slanted roof, faded green shutters, but there was something alive in its stillness. The realtor was talking about square footage and irrigation systems, but I wasn't listening. I was watching the way the sunlight hit the porch steps. They were cracked but solid, like a life that had been used but never broken. "This is where I'll start over," I said quietly. She smiled. "It's yours if you want it. The seller's ready to close immediately." "I'm ready too." By the end of the week, the papers were signed. I left the city behind with 2 suitcases, my father's old drafting pencil, and a small cedar box filled with letters I'd never sent to Lucas, to Gabriel, even to the girl I used to be before everything revolved around sacrifice. I drove south through the desert, the road stretching like a line drawn between the woman I had been and the one I was becoming. The first night in the new house, I slept on an air mattress in the middle of the empty living room. The silence wasn't intimidating anymore. It was music I finally understood. I woke to the sound of birds, made coffee, and watched the sunrise through uncurtained windows. The world outside looked enormous, and for the first time, I didn't feel small inside it. I spent the next few days unpacking what little I had brought. Every item had been chosen with intention, no relics of guilt, no objects that begged for memory. The walls stayed bare for a while, and that was fine. I needed emptiness to remember what fullness meant. One morning, as I was planting lavender along the walkway, a woman from the neighboring house called over the fence. "You must be the new owner," she said, her accent lilting. "I'm Evelyn, and I make terrible coffee but good company." That was how it began. Evelyn was 70, a retired schoolteacher with a laugh that came from her whole body. She brought cookies, gossip, and stories about every house on the block. Her husband, George, was mostly quiet, but he had kind eyes and a habit of fixing things that weren't broken. For the first time in decades, I had neighbors who saw me as a person, not a provider. A week later, Evelyn invited me to the local community center, where retired women gathered every Wednesday to knit, argue, and drink too much tea. I expected awkward smiles and polite distance, but instead, they welcomed me like a long-lost friend. They spoke of gardens, lost husbands, and grandchildren with the same reverence I once reserved for business meetings. At one point, Rita, a woman in a coral dress, leaned toward me. "You're the one who sold the construction firm, right? I read about you in the paper." My instinct was to deflect, but something in her tone, neither admiration nor pity, just curiosity, made me answer honestly. "Yes. I built it for 35 years and left it behind in one day." She smiled knowingly. "Then you didn't leave it behind. You carried what mattered." That night, I thought about her words. She was right. The work had always been my way of loving the world, of building something that lasted longer than mistakes. The betrayal hadn't erased that, it had refined it. 2 days later, I received a letter from Victor. Inside was a single-page summary of the finalized trust. The language was precise and firm. My assets secured, my estate redirected toward initiatives I would personally design. Beneath the legal phrasing, he had written in his own hand, "You have space now, Mariana. Build something that gives back only to those who never took." I spent hours thinking about that sentence. Then I opened my notebook and began sketching not buildings this time, but plans for a foundation. I would call it Blueprints for Dignity. An organization that would teach older women practical financial and housing skills, the tools to protect what they built. I knew exactly what it would feel like to be standing at the edge of ruin, unsure of your worth. I wanted no one else to feel that way again. The project consumed me in the best possible way. By the end of the second month, I had filed the paperwork, drafted partnerships, and gathered a small team of volunteers from the community center. Evelyn, of course, insisted on being treasurer. "If I can balance bingo winnings," she said, "I can handle your books." During one of our meetings, a knock echoed through the hall. A courier stood outside holding a letter addressed to me in familiar handwriting. My heart stuttered. It was from Lucas. For a long minute I just held it, tracing the name, the uneven pressure of his pen. Then, slowly, I opened it. "Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect a reply. I lost my job last month, and Isabella left. I found one of your old notebooks in a box. It was the plan for the Riverview School. You wrote on the margin, "Every wall stands for someone who needs shelter." I didn't understand that then. I think I do now. I'm trying to start over. I hope you're okay. I read it twice. The words weren't an apology, not fully, but they were a beginning, a crack where light could enter. I didn't cry. I simply folded the letter, placed it inside my cedar box, and whispered, "Maybe someday." That evening, as the sun dipped low, I walked out to the lavender garden. The air smelled like warmth and renewal. Evelyn waved from her porch. "Big day tomorrow," she called. "Your foundation launch!" "Yes," I said, smiling. "Big day." The next morning, the small community hall was filled beyond expectation. Neighbors, local reporters, women who had once been dismissed, forgotten, or underestimated. As I stepped to the microphone, I looked out at the crowd and felt something rare: purpose, clean and untainted. "I spent most of my life building things out of concrete," I began. "But the strongest structures are made of something else: trust, resilience, and dignity. This foundation isn't about revenge or regret, it's about reconstruction." Applause swelled, but I barely heard it. What I heard instead was the faint echo of every woman who had ever been told she was too late, too small, too dependent. When it was over, Evelyn hugged me tightly. "You look lighter," she said. "I am," I answered. "Maybe forgiveness isn't something you give, it's something you grow." That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the horizon bleed gold and violet. Somewhere out there, my son was learning to live with the consequences of his choices, but I wasn't waiting anymore. I had my peace, my purpose, and a life built on my own foundation, unbreakable, unborrowed, and finally, beautifully mine. The first anniversary of Blueprints for Dignity came faster than I expected. The foundation had grown beyond my small Arizona street. Local papers had covered our workshops. Community centers in 2 nearby towns had requested training programs, and a university invited me to speak about elder financial independence. I should have felt fulfilled, but a quiet ache had settled behind my ribs, one I couldn't quite name. It began the morning I found another envelope in my mailbox. No return address this time, only my name, in careful, familiar handwriting. Inside was a photograph, Lucas, standing in front of a modest construction site, hard hat tilted, face thinner but calm. Behind him hung a banner, "Rebuild Works, Community Housing Initiative." Beneath the photo, a single line, "Trying to make something that stands for the right reasons. Thought you'd like to know." For a long while, I just stared at it. The desert wind tugged at the page, making it flutter like a heartbeat. Maybe this was what growth looked like: messy, uncertain, but alive. 2 days later, I received an invitation to an industry gala in Phoenix. I had ignored every such event for a year, but this one was different. The email subject read, "Lifetime Achievement Recognition, Mariana Cruz." I laughed out loud when I saw it. The same circles that had whispered about my downfall now wanted to crown me with nostalgia. Still, I went. Not for them, but for closure. The ballroom was a mirror of the one from Lucas's wedding, the same chandeliers, the same polished marble floor, but the reflection staring back at me this time was not the woman who once trembled behind a wine glass. I wore a simple navy gown, my hair silver and unapologetic. When the announcer called my name, I felt the crowd rise in polite applause. The presenter, a man who had once tried to undercut my contracts, handed me the award with rehearsed sincerity. "Miss Cruz," he said into the microphone, "you've built more than structures. You've built a legacy." I took the small plaque in my hands and let the moment stretch. The crowd quieted. "I appreciate this," I began slowly. "But legacy is a strange word. It's often what people say when they think your story has ended. Mine hasn't." A soft murmur rippled through the room. I continued, voice steady. "I made the mistake of confusing legacy with inheritance once. I thought giving was the same as loving, that sacrifice guaranteed gratitude. It doesn't. But what betrayal taught me is this: you can lose everything you built and still not lose yourself. The foundation remains in you, waiting for a better purpose." When I finished, the applause was not loud, it was thoughtful. And that was enough. After the event, as I walked through the lobby, a young woman approached me. "Miss Cruz?" she asked shyly. "I attended one of your workshops last month. My mother almost lost her home after my brother forged her signature on a loan. Your story saved her." Her words hit me harder than any award could. "Tell your mother she saved herself," I said. All I did was hand her the tools. That night, back home, I placed the plaque on a shelf not in pride, but in acknowledgement. Then I opened my cedar box and took out Lucas's photo. I set it beside the award. 2 symbols of rebuilding, one public, one private. Days later, Evelyn came by with lemon pie and gossip, as always. "You're glowing," she said. "Did they finally put your face on one of those city billboards?" "Not yet," I laughed, "but maybe one day." As we talked, the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. "Mom?" The voice was tentative, uncertain. "Lucas." I didn't speak at first. "I heard about your award," he continued. "I saw the video. You looked happy." "I am," I said simply. There was a pause. Then, "I'd like to see you, if you'll let me." It would have been easier to say no to preserve the safety of distance, but something inside me softened. "All right," I said. "Come on Sunday, afternoon." When he arrived, I almost didn't recognize him. The arrogance had drained from his posture. He carried no pretense, no tailored suit, just the weary humility of a man who had rebuilt himself from the ground up. He handed me a folded paper. "Blueprints," he said. "Affordable housing. We just finished our first site. I named it the Cruz Block, not because I deserve your name, but because I want to honor it the right way this time." My throat tightened. I looked at the drawing: modest homes, open courtyards, a design focused on light and airflow. It was beautiful in its simplicity. "Do you like it?" he asked. "I do," I said. "It breathes." He smiled faintly. "So do I, finally." We sat for hours, talking not about the past, but about what could come next. He told me about losing everything, about working with his hands again, about realizing that creation mattered more than image. When he left that evening, he hugged me, not the shallow, polite embrace of obligation, but the quiet one of recognition. After he drove off, I stood on the porch until the horizon turned gold. I didn't feel triumph or regret, just peace, the kind that comes when the pieces finally find their rightful places. Weeks passed, and the foundation kept expanding. We partnered with Lucas's initiative for low-cost materials, blending his new purpose with mine. There was irony in it, mother and son rebuilding the world together after tearing their own apart. But perhaps that was life's design. Every collapse leaves behind the knowledge of how not to fall again. On the evening of our first joint project's completion, I walked through the nearly finished homes. Fresh paint, open doors, laughter from volunteers filling the rooms. I thought of every version of myself that had led here: the builder, the mother, the abandoned, the reborn. As the sun dipped low, Lucas joined me at the threshold. "You know," he said, "Dad called last week. He wants to visit." I smiled softly. "Let him. Maybe we've all got rebuilding left to do." He nodded, eyes glistening. "You were right, Mom. Foundations don't fail because of cracks. They fail because no one checks them." I reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Then promise me you'll keep checking yours." He looked at me with quiet conviction. "I will." That night, when everyone had gone, I walked through the empty lot one last time. The desert air was cool, fragrant with dust and hope. I whispered a silent prayer, not for forgiveness or closure, but for continuity. Because stories like mine don't end in revenge, they end in restoration. And as the stars appeared one by one above the newly built roofs, I finally understood what my father had meant all along. The true measure of strength isn't how high you build, but how well you rise after everything falls. Autumn arrived gently in Arizona, softening the air and tinting the desert with gold. By then, blueprints for dignity had spread to 3 states, and Lucas's rebuild works had become our closest partner. The media called us the Cruz Legacy Duo, a title that made both of us laugh for different reasons. He laughed because he couldn't believe anyone still associated our name with hope. I laughed because I finally could. The partnership had given me new rhythm. My mornings began with planning calls, afternoons at construction sites, evenings with handwritten notes from women who had taken our workshops and started over. Each story was a reminder that strength doesn't roar, it whispers, rebuilds, repeats. Yet behind the growth, something unsettled me. My body was slowing down. It started with small things, fatigue that clung like fog, tremors in my hands when I held a pen too long. I ignored it at first, convincing myself it was just the desert heat. But one afternoon, while inspecting the new housing site, I felt the world tilt. The ground seemed to move under me. When I woke, Lucas's face was above mine, his voice tight with fear. At the hospital, the diagnosis came quietly but definitively: early-stage Parkinson's. The doctor spoke gently, outlining treatments and physical therapy, his tone clinical yet kind. I listened in silence, tracing the grain of the wooden table between us. After everything, the humiliation, the betrayal, the rebuilding, this was the battle I hadn't prepared for. That night, back home, Lucas sat across from me on the porch. The silence was heavy, but not hopeless. "You don't have to keep pushing," he said softly. I smiled. "That's what you said when you were 12 and didn't want to finish your homework." He looked down, ashamed and amused all at once. "I mean it, Mom. You've done enough." "No, Lucas," I said, voice steady. "I've done a lot. But enough is what you say when you stop believing you can still shape tomorrow. I won't stop building. I'll just build differently." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll build with you." The following weeks changed the rhythm of my life again. I learned to work around the tremors, to dictate letters when my fingers wouldn't obey, to find pride in the patience my body demanded. Evelyn visited often, bringing herbal teas and relentless optimism. "You built a whole empire from dust," she'd say. "This is just another project your body's remodeling itself." Her humor was both medicine and mirror. I began keeping a journal not of symptoms, but of moments worth remembering. Each page became a sketch of gratitude, a volunteer's laughter echoing through half-painted walls, a child's drawing of their new home, Lucas kneeling to fix a cracked tile without being asked. Months passed. Then came an invitation that carried more weight than any before: a national broadcast requesting an interview about the foundation. The producer's email described it as an inspiring feature on women who redefine resilience. I hesitated, uncertain if I wanted to make my story public again, but Lucas insisted. "You've spent years teaching people not to hide their strength," he said. "Now it's your turn." The interview took place in a small studio overlooking the desert. The host was kind, her questions gentle but piercing. "You've been through public betrayal, financial loss, and now a health challenge," she said. "What keeps you from giving up?" I looked into the camera and said what I had finally learned to believe. Because the moment I stop, the people watching who've been told it's too late will think they should stop too. And I refused to be anyone's permission to surrender. When the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. Letters flooded in from women, from men, from families who had lost everything and found courage in our story. One message, though, stood out. It came from Gabriel. "Mariana, I watched your interview. I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know you were always the stronger builder. I see that now. Thank you for what you did for Lucas and for me, even when I didn't deserve it." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in my cedar box. Life has a way of circling back to what's unfinished, not to reopen wounds, but to prove they've healed. As winter approached, Lucas suggested a small celebration at the newest housing site, a way to honor our volunteers and the families moving in. We kept it simple: folding chairs, strings of lights, homemade food. When I stepped up to speak, my hands trembled, but my voice did not. "Every wall you see here stands because someone refused to be defined by what broke them," I began. "We built homes, yes, but more importantly, we built dignity. And dignity is the only inheritance that never depreciates." The crowd rose in applause. Somewhere among them I saw Lucas wipe his eyes. Later that night, as the last lights flickered out, He joined me under the stars. "You know," he said, "when I was a kid, I thought strength meant control. Now I think it means letting go and still showing up." I smiled. "Then you've finally learned what it took me 69 years to understand." He looked at me for a long moment. "If something happens to you, then you'll keep building," I interrupted gently, "and not out of guilt, out of gratitude." He nodded. "I promise." Weeks later, on my 70th birthday, he surprised me with a plaque installed at the foundation's entrance, the Mariana Cruz Center built on resilience. Underneath, a small inscription read, "For the woman who taught us that love can build even from ruins." I stood there, reading it, feeling the weight of everything that had led here, the humiliation that birthed strength, the betrayal that carved clarity, the illness that taught surrender without defeat. The world had not given me mercy, but it had given me meaning, and that was enough. That night, I sat alone in the lavender garden, stars spread wide across the desert sky. My hands trembled as I lifted my cup of tea, but the movement no longer frightened me. It was proof I was still alive, still building, still here. And as the wind whispered through the fields, I realized something simple and profound. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about survival so graceful it becomes its own kind of justice. The spring after my 70th birthday came with an unexpected quiet, a calm so complete that it frightened me at first. The foundation ran smoothly without my constant oversight. Lucas had stepped into leadership with confidence, surrounded by a capable team. Evelyn's laughter still drifted across the street in the evenings, and the lavender garden was in bloom. Yet, beneath all that beauty, I felt time shifting softly, insistently reminding me that even the strongest structures must one day let others carry the weight. I began to notice how memory softened its edges. My body moved slower, my voice a little thinner, but I was not fading. I was transforming, distilling into something simpler, more honest. I spent my mornings on the porch, writing letters not of business or instruction, but of gratitude, to Victor, for his steadfast loyalty, to Evelyn and George, for their friendship that came without conditions, and to Lucas, though that one took me 3 drafts to complete. The first version was too formal, the second too sentimental, the third was right. "My son, the world will measure you by what you build, but I hope you remember that what you repair matters more. Forgiveness is not the end of anger, it is the proof that you have outgrown it. Keep building, but never forget the ground you're standing on. It was once broken, too." I sealed the letter and placed it in my cedar box, now filled with the relics of every turning point in my life. It would be his someday, not as inheritance but as record, a blueprint of the heart that raised him. One afternoon, Lucas came by unexpectedly, carrying blueprints under his arm and takeout food in his hand. "You didn't eat lunch again," he said, half chiding, half smiling. He spread the plans across the table: new housing projects, expansion to New Mexico, partnership proposals. I watched him talk, animated and sure, and realized that I no longer recognized the boy who once needed my approval. This was a man who had learned from ruin how to build with purpose. At one point he paused. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking. You should take time for yourself. Travel, rest. Let me handle things for a while." I smiled gently. "You say that like I'm a machine that can be turned off." He chuckled. "You've earned it. You don't always have to be in motion to matter." That night, I lay awake thinking about his words. For so long, movement had been my proof of existence, plans, projects, progress. Maybe he was right. Maybe stillness could be its own kind of contribution. A few weeks later, I made my decision. I announced that I would step down as director and remain as advisor. The board protested. Lucas hesitated, but I insisted. "Leadership," I told them, "isn't about staying in front. It's about knowing when to step aside without letting the work fall." The day of the transition, the staff surprised me with a gathering at the foundation's courtyard. There were flowers, candles, laughter, and music played by a local guitarist whose songs reminded me of my youth in Veracruz. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare notes. I simply spoke from where truth lives. "Every person here has carried a brick of this work," I said. "Some of you carried the weight when I couldn't. Some of you joined when it was already standing. What matters isn't who built which wall, it's that we built together. My hands may tremble now, but this legacy is steady. There were tears, yes, but they were soft, cleansing tears, the kind that don't sting. Later that night, when everyone had gone, I lingered in the empty courtyard. The fountain murmured, the air was thick with jasmine, and for the first time in decades, I felt no need to plan tomorrow. I thought about my father, about the sound of his pencil scratching blueprints late into the night. I wondered if he had ever imagined his daughter would draw a life so different, yet so rooted in his lessons. The following morning, Lucas drove me out to a hill overlooking the new development. Dozens of houses shimmered in the early light, roofs like scales of silver and clay. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "It's yours," he said. "No," I corrected softly. "It's ours." He looked at me, eyes bright. "You once told me every wall stands for someone who needs shelter. I finally understand what you meant." I reached for his hand. "Then promise me one thing: never let the work become louder than the people it serves." "I promise." That afternoon, he drove me home, and as he turned to leave, I felt the same peace I had felt the day I sold the company, the peace that comes from finishing something without losing yourself. In the weeks that followed, I began recording my memories, not as a memoir, but as a guide, small stories for the women who would one day find themselves standing where I once stood, between anger and grace, between survival and surrender. I titled it Foundations That Last. I wrote of my mistakes, of Lucas's redemption, of how forgiveness isn't weakness but the architecture of freedom. I wrote about betrayal, not as the end of love, but as its final test. And I wrote of time not as an enemy, but as a quiet craftsman, shaping us with patience we don't always recognize. One evening, Evelyn came by with tea and her usual humor. "You're glowing again," she teased. "What's the secret this time?" "Acceptance," I said simply. She nodded. "That's the hardest thing to build, isn't it?" "Yes," I said, smiling, "and the only one that never collapses." By the start of summer, the manuscript was complete. I mailed a copy to the foundation office and another to Lucas. The rest I kept for myself, tucked inside the cedar box beside his letter and the old award plaque. My story had come full circle, but this time, I wasn't closing a chapter, I was opening a door for others to walk through. That night, as the desert sky blazed with stars, I whispered a quiet truth to the wind. The greatest revenge is not triumph, it's peace. The house around me seemed to breathe with that thought. I sat in the lavender garden until the moon rose, feeling my pulse slow, my breath steady, my heart unburdened. The journey had been long, brutal, and beautiful, but it had led me exactly where I needed to be home, within myself. The last chapter of my life didn't begin with fanfare, it began with silence, the kind that hums at dawn, before the world decides what it will be. I woke earlier than usual, the soft ache in my hands reminding me that time keeps its own calendar. The lavender outside my window shimmered under the first light, and the air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clear. It felt like a message from the universe. Endings don't always announce themselves. They simply arrive, gentle and certain. It had been nearly 2 years since I stepped down from the foundation. Lucas had transformed it into something even I hadn't dared to imagine: programs in 6 states, partnerships with universities, scholarships for women returning to the workforce after 50. Every so often, he would send me reports and photos, though he still prefaced them with, "I know you're retired, but just look at this one." I spent my days differently now. Mornings in the garden, afternoons writing letters for the foundation's new mentorship program, evenings reading, sometimes by lamplight, sometimes by the glow of memory. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet grace in living without demand. Yet, every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about the strange symmetry of life, the way it folds back on itself like a blueprint re-examined. One morning, Lucas arrived unannounced, his truck rumbling down the gravel road. He carried a cardboard tube under one arm and a basket of groceries in the other. "You always forget to shop," he said, setting everything down with practiced ease. "And you always overcompensate," I teased. He grinned and handed me the tube. "Open it." Inside was a rolled blueprint hand-drawn, the lines imperfect but full of life. When I unrolled it across the table, I saw the title at the top, Cruise Haven, a community for second chances. It's a residential space for older women, he explained. Affordable housing, gardens, on-site health support. Every house will be named after one of the women you helped. My throat tightened. You're naming this after me? Not after you, he said softly. Because of you. The words hit something deep inside me, a place where pride and humility coexist. I traced the lines of the design with trembling fingers. It's beautiful, I whispered. He shrugged, smiling the way his father once did when he was proud but didn't want to show it. You taught me that a house is more than walls, it's a promise. That night, after he left, I sat by the window for a long time. The sky was full of stars, but I wasn't counting them. I was thinking about promises, the ones I'd kept, the ones I'd broken, and the ones that had saved me. Weeks later, Lucas called to tell me the groundbreaking ceremony was set for late May. He wanted me there to place the first stone. I agreed, though part of me wondered if I had the strength. My health had worsened slightly, my movement slower, the tremor stronger. But I told myself the same thing I told so many others. You finish what you begin, no matter the pace. The morning of the ceremony was warm and bright. The desert air carried the scent of sage and new soil. When I arrived, there were dozens of people, volunteers, journalists, women whose lives had intertwined with the Foundation's mission. As I stepped out of the car, applause rippled through the crowd. It felt surreal, as if the sound belonged to someone else's story. Lucas helped me up to the podium, his arm steadying me. Cameras flashed, but I barely noticed. What I did notice was the sight of women standing in front of me, strong, unbroken, radiant in their resilience. I took a slow breath and began to speak. When I started building structures, I thought strength came from steel and stone. I was wrong. True strength comes from people, especially those who have every reason to give up but choose to stand again. This community, this place, is not my legacy. It's ours. Because survival, when shared, becomes grace. When the applause ended, Lucas handed me a smooth river stone engraved with my father's old saying, "Measure twice, cut once." Together, we lowered it into the foundation trench. The crowd cheered, and I felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from fullness, the kind that comes when life completes its design. That night, back home, I could still feel the earth's coolness on my fingertips. I opened my cedar box for what I knew might be the last time. Inside were the letters, the photograph of Lucas at his first sight, Gabriel's apology, the Foundation's charter, and the plaque from the award I once thought defined me. I added one last item, a small lavender sprig tied with twine, and whispered, "For the next builder." The following weeks were quiet again. My energy waned, but my spirit felt light. Evelyn visited daily, insisting on cooking meals and retelling the same stories I'd heard 100 times. "You know," she said one afternoon, "you never really stopped building. You just switched materials from concrete to courage." I laughed softly. "Then let's hope it holds as long as the first did." She took my hand. "It already has." As the days shortened and the lavender began to fade, I found myself writing one final entry in my journal. Everything we build eventually leaves our hands, but not our mark. I used to think justice meant punishment. Now I know it means peace, the kind that rebuilds instead of ruins. One evening, Lucas called from the site. "Mom, the first cottages are up. I wish you could see them." "I can," I said, smiling. "Just describe them." He did every detail, every color, until I could picture them perfectly. When he finished, I said, "They'll stand longer than we will, and that's how it should be." There was a pause, then his voice softened. "You made that possible." "No," I whispered. "We both did." That night, I slept deeply. I dreamt of blueprints that glowed in the dark lines, turning into roads, roads into homes, homes into laughter. I dreamt of my father, of Gabriel, of the younger version of myself who once believed silence meant defeat. She was smiling. When dawn came, the lavender shimmered once more under the desert light. The house was still, the world quiet, and I felt no fear. My story had come full circle from building for others to building within myself. And somewhere, beyond time, I imagined the next generation of women walking through the gates of Cruise Haven, holding keys, holding hope, and whispering the same words that had carried me through every ruin and rebuild. You build, you lose, you rebuild better. In the end, Mariana's story was never truly about revenge, wealth, or even redemption. It was about rebuilding from the ruins of betrayal, from the ashes of humiliation, and from the quiet ache of time. Every brick she laid after her fall wasn't for the world to see, it was for her own soul, a reminder that dignity cannot be stolen, only surrendered. Through every loss, she discovered a greater kind of victory, the power of self-respect, of boundaries, of choosing peace over approval. What began as an act of pain became a blueprint for freedom. She started as a mother defined by sacrifice, silenced by the people she loved most. But she ended as a woman who learned that love without respect is dependency, and forgiveness without wisdom is self-destruction. By standing tall in her truth, she transformed from victim to visionary, turning betrayal into a foundation that helped others stand again. Her journey showed that revenge doesn't have to look like destruction. Sometimes it's simply the grace of living well, of thriving so honestly that those who doubted you must watch you rise. Mariana's legacy reminds us that no matter our age, our wounds, or our regrets, it's never too late to begin again. She built homes, but more importantly, she rebuilt hearts her own, her sons, and those of countless women who once thought their stories were over. Her life teaches that the truest justice is not in punishment, but in transformation, not in proving others wrong, but in proving yourself right about who you were meant to be. The deeper message is simple yet profound. Strength is not measured by what you endure, but by what you create after the breaking. In life, you will be betrayed, underestimated, or dismissed. But every collapse is also an invitation to rebuild differently, more intentionally. When you face loss, don't chase revenge. Invest that energy in reconstruction. Whether it's a relationship, a dream, or your self-worth, start again with integrity as your cornerstone, because when peace becomes your response, you've already won the war. So, after hearing Mariana's story, let me ask you, if you were given one more chance to rebuild something in your life, a broken relationship, a forgotten dream, or even your sense of purpose, what would you choose to rebuild first, and why? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be the light someone else needs tonight. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating heartfelt stories about courage, justice, and second chances.